My sister broke into our garage and destroyed my 9-year-old son's robotics project, the one he'd spent 6 months building for state competition. She texted me right after, "Now your son won't embarrass my son." The next morning, my son's teacher called and told me she'd installed security cameras in the school's designated project storage area, but also that she'd captured something outside her window that faced our block. When I pulled up my phone and showed my sister the footage on that tiny screen, her face went pale. She couldn't speak. Not a single word. Just her face draining of color while the timestamp in the bottom right corner read 11:43 p.m., and every person in that room watched her watch herself do the thing she'd been pretending she never did. Let me tell you how we got here, because this didn't start with a garage break-in. It started the way most family disasters start, quietly and years before anyone was willing to admit there was a problem. My name is Rachel. I'm 38 years old. I live in a 3-bedroom house on Mercer Street in Columbus, Ohio, about 4 miles from the house where my sister Dana and I grew up. We were never what you'd call close, not even as kids. There were 4 years between us. She was the older one, and our parents had always managed, somehow unintentionally and yet precisely, to structure every childhood milestone as a competition. Who got better grades? Who had more friends? Who made the travel soccer team? I don't think my parents meant to do it. I genuinely believe that. But the shape of what they built between us was a rivalry that never fully cooled, even decades later, even when we were adults with our own children and our own mortgages and our own separate lives that should have had nothing to do with each other. Dana had 2 kids, Tyler, who is 11, and a younger daughter named Becca. My son Marcus is 9. He was born in March of 2015, right around the time I was finishing up my master's in mechanical engineering at Ohio State, a degree I started part-time when he was barely 2 months old, nursing him between lectures, using whatever margin of sanity remained after working full-time as a CAD technician at a mid-level manufacturing firm in Westerville. Dana had made a point of noting, at Marcus's first birthday party, in front of my parents and her own husband, that I was still doing that degree thing. Like it was a hobby. Like it was something I was dabbling in between soap making and watercolor classes. "I just think it's a lot," she'd said, cutting a slice of birthday cake with the practiced authority of someone who had never second-guessed a single decision in her life. "Working full-time, going to school, raising a baby. Something's going to fall through the cracks, Rachel. That's just reality." I smiled and handed Marcus a piece of frosted vanilla cake and didn't say anything. She was wrong about something falling through the cracks. But I didn't know that yet, not in any way I could prove. So I smiled. That was the pattern. That was always the pattern with Dana. She would say something that landed just barely inside the border of plausible concern, just innocuous enough that if you called it out, you'd look petty. And then she'd smile, and the moment would pass, and 6 months later she'd do it again, and the structure would be exactly the same. After a while, you start keeping a kind of internal ledger. Not because you're planning something. Just because the accumulation of a thing starts to take shape, and at some point you can't look at it without seeing the entire outline. I finished my master's in May of 2017. The ceremony was on a Saturday. My parents came. My husband Greg came, and he brought Marcus in a tiny clip-on tie. Dana did not come. She sent a text that morning that said, "So sorry, Tyler has a game. So proud of you though. Congrats." 3 exclamation marks. Tyler's soccer games happened on Saturdays roughly 40 weeks out of the year. She had known about the graduation date for 4 months. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because it means by the time Marcus was old enough to start caring about things, really caring, with the specific intensity that 9-year-olds bring to the things they love, I already understood, clearly and completely. That Dana was not someone who would be happy for him. Not if being happy for him meant acknowledging that his mother had done something worth being proud of. Marcus got into robotics the summer before 3rd grade. It started almost accidentally. Greg's colleague had a son who was in a first Lego League club at a community center in Dublin, and Marcus went to one meeting as a tag-along and never looked back. By September, he'd joined the school robotics club at Riverside Elementary. By October, he was the kid staying late. By November, his teacher, a woman named Mrs. Kathleen Hargrove, who has been teaching fourth grade at Riverside for 19 years and who I will come back to in a significant way, pulled me aside after pickup one afternoon and said, "I want to be honest with you. In a decade of running this program, I have not seen a kid Marcus's age with this level of intuitive spatial reasoning. He's something special." I drove home and cried in my driveway for about 6 minutes. The quietly spectacular kind of crying, where you're not even sure why it's hitting as hard as it is. Then I went inside and helped him with his homework. The project started in August. Mrs. Hargrove had restructured the school's annual science showcase to align with the Ohio Regional Junior Engineering and Robotics Competition, what everyone called the Ohio JREC. The state-level competition was scheduled for March 15th, a Saturday, at the Greater Columbus Convention Center. To qualify, students had to submit project proposals in October, build and document through the fall, and present at the regional qualifier in February. If they scored in the top 10% at regionals, they moved on to state. Marcus chose to build a small autonomous robot capable of navigating a simple obstacle course and sorting colored objects into corresponding containers using a basic computer vision program. For a 9-year-old, this was ambitious in a way that made two different people, including a mechanical engineering professor I happened to know from my graduate program, blink twice when I described it to them. For Marcus, it was just the thing he wanted to build. He started in August. He worked on it every day. I'm going to say that again because I want you to understand what 6 months of a child's complete dedication looks like in real time, every day. After school, before dinner, on weekends, during holiday breaks. He had a notebook, a brown composition book with a piece of masking tape on the cover that said robot notes in his handwriting, that he filled with diagrams and measurements and calculations and things that were crossed out and redrawn and crossed out again. He asked for help when he needed it, mostly from me and occasionally from Mrs. Hargrove, but the project was his. The ideas were his. The troubleshooting was his. I sat next to him at our kitchen table on many of those evenings, my own laptop open, doing my own work, and I watched him figure things out with the patient, relentless energy that children deploy when they genuinely love what they're doing. By December, he had a working prototype. By January, the chassis was complete and the color detection algorithm was running at roughly 80% accuracy. I'd helped him find a basic Python tutorial, but the logic of what it was doing was his. By mid-February, he had demonstrated the completed project at the regional qualifier and scored in the top 7%. He was going to state. Dana found out at a family dinner at my parents' house in late February. My mother had mentioned it. I don't think my mother did it maliciously. She was proud, and grandmothers mentioned things, but I noticed the moment Dana heard it. She'd been talking to my father about Tyler's soccer league. She stopped talking. Just for a second. Her eyes went very still. Then she picked up her wine glass. "Oh, Marcus made it to state? That's great," she said. The flatness in her voice was calibrated precisely below the threshold where anyone could call it out. Tyler was sitting across from Marcus at the other end of the table. Tyler was a perfectly nice kid who had done nothing wrong in his life, but he was also a kid who had been raised to believe that he was exceptional and who had, from what I could observe, a relatively ordinary interest in robots and a far more competitive relationship with his cousin than Marcus had ever been aware of. Dana had signed Tyler up for the school robotics club earlier that year. He'd qualified for regionals. He had not scored high enough to go to state. Tyler worked really hard on his project too, my mother said, in the diplomatic tone she'd been deploying between her daughters since approximately 1989. He did, I said. You should be proud of him. Dana didn't say anything. She sipped her wine. Her jaw was doing a thing I recognized. I noticed right then that she'd stopped eating. We'd been there for 2 hours and 40 minutes. That was February 27th. The state competition was March 15th. Marcus had 16 days. He spent those 16 days doing final calibrations. His robot, he'd named it Scrap, which stood for Sorting, Classifying, and Routing Autonomous Program, had been stored in Mrs. Hargrove's classroom supply room every night for the past 3 weeks while school was in session, per her personal policy for competition projects. But in the week leading up to state, she told parents they could take projects home for final tuning and to bring them back the Thursday before the competition for pre-competition check-in. We brought scrap home on Tuesday evening, March 11th, at 5:30 p.m. Greg put it in the garage carefully on the work table along the back wall, covered with a clean moving blanket. It was about 2 feet long, made of powder-coated aluminum chassis pieces, an Arduino Mega board, 2 servo motors, a small camera module mounted on a bracket, and approximately 412 cable ties. Marcus had counted. The moving blanket was Greg's idea. He took a picture of it on his phone and texted it to me from 12 feet away because he thought it was funny, and I saved that picture. That was Tuesday evening. Wednesday night, March 12th, I couldn't sleep. I got up at 2 a.m. to get water, and I noticed the light on my phone. A text from Dana. 11:58 p.m. The text said, "Now your son won't embarrass my son." I sat in the kitchen for a long time. Then I went to the garage. Scrap was in pieces on the floor. Not dropped and broken pieces. Taken apart. Deliberately separated. The chassis had been pulled apart at the joints. You'd have needed to know where the bolts were. The camera module had been removed and set aside, but the mounting bracket had been bent. The Arduino board had been pulled out and placed on the floor, and something, I still don't know exactly what, but something sharp had been dragged across it twice. The cable ties were in a pile in the corner, cut. 387 of them, I would later count, because Marcus wanted to know. The garage door had been opened from outside. We have a keypad. My parents have the code, and Dana has the code, because 2 years ago Greg had asked me to give it to family in case of emergencies, and I had, stupidly and good-naturedly, done exactly that. I stood in my garage at 2:17 in the morning looking at 6 months of my son's work on a concrete floor, and I thought, with a clarity that came from somewhere very cold and very focused, she is not going to get away with this. I called the non-emergency police line at 2:24 a.m. and reported a break-in. Then I sat at the kitchen table and waited for Marcus to wake up. He came downstairs at 6:42 a.m. I was still at the kitchen table. He could tell immediately from my face that something was wrong. He was 9, not 6. I told him there had been an accident with the project. I used that word deliberately. He asked if it was fixable. I said I didn't know yet, but that we were going to figure it out. He nodded, very seriously, and got himself a bowl of cereal, and I loved him so much in that moment that I couldn't look directly at his face. At 8:15 a.m., Mrs. Hargrove called me. I'd already been planning to call her, but she called first. "Rachel," she said, "I want to tell you something before you hear it from anyone else. I installed security cameras outside my classroom window 2 weeks ago. I've had issues with things going missing from the supply room, and I petitioned the district and they approved it. The cameras also capture the parking lot and part of Mercer Street, because the school sits on the corner." I gripped the phone. "Okay," I said. "I checked the footage this morning out of habit," she said. "There's footage from last night, from around 11:30 p.m., of your driveway and your garage." My hands had stopped shaking by the time she finished talking. I hadn't realized they'd been shaking until they stopped. "I'm going to need a copy of that," I said. "I've already saved it," she said. "And I've already called the district. Rachel, the competition board also needs to know what happened. Can you come in?" I was at Riverside Elementary at 8:47 a.m. The footage was clear. Mrs. Hargrove had dual cameras, a wide exterior camera that captured the front of the school and the parking lot, and a secondary camera angled toward Mercer Street that she'd installed after someone had broken into a teacher's car parked on the block. At 11:41 p.m. the previous evening, a silver Honda Pilot pulled up to the curb in front of our house. I recognized the car before I recognized the figure. Dana drove a silver 2021 Honda Pilot. She'd bought it in November and had complained about the monthly payment at Christmas. She got out. She walked up the driveway. She punched the garage code into the keypad. We could see it on the footage, her hand moving deliberately, and the garage door rose. The timestamp read 11:43 p.m. She was inside for 14 minutes. She came back out at 11:57 p.m. carrying nothing, got back in her car and drove away. 1 minute later, 11:58 p.m., she sent me the text. I sat in Mrs. Hargrove's classroom for a moment and looked at the screen of the laptop and didn't say anything. Mrs. Hargrove was very quiet too. Outside the window, I could hear the distant sound of kids arriving for school. I'd like to show her this, I said. That is entirely your right, Mrs. Hargrove said. I called Dana from the parking lot. I told her I needed her to come to Riverside Elementary. I told her it was about the project. She said, and I remember this precisely, Rachel, I don't have time for this. Tyler has practice at 4. 11-year-old soccer practice. At 4 in the afternoon. It was 9 in the morning. Dana, I said. Come to the school. Please. Something in my voice stopped her. She came. She arrived at 9:34 a.m. She was wearing a gray Lululemon zip-up and mom jeans and her hair was in a ponytail. She looked exactly like someone who had slept fine. She walked into Mrs. Hargrove's classroom with the specific body language of someone who had decided in the car that whatever she was about to face, she was going to manage it. She glanced around, saw me, saw Mrs. Hargrove, saw the laptop on the desk, and set her purse on a chair by the door. What is this about? She said. Flat. Not hostile, just flat. Like I'd summoned her to discuss a scheduling issue. Sit down, I said. I'd rather stand. Okay. I turned the laptop toward her and pressed play. She watched herself pull up to our curb at 11:41 p.m. She watched herself walk up the driveway. She watched herself punch the code into the keypad. For approximately 4 seconds, nothing happened on her face. She was processing, registering, calculating. I watched it happen. I've thought about those 4 seconds a lot since then. Then the colors started to leave her face. She started. I let the footage keep playing. 11:43 p.m. She went into the garage. 11:57 p.m. She came out. Rachel. Don't, I said. She closed her mouth. The footage ended. The screen went dark. The room was very quiet. I could hear someone's phone buzz somewhere down the hall. Mrs. Hargrove had been sitting at her desk during all of this, very still, her hands folded on a manila folder. Now she cleared her throat gently. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, Dana had married a man named Brian Whitfield. I want you to understand where this stands officially. I've already sent a copy of this footage to the district administration, to the police officer who took Rachel's report this morning, and to the Ohio JREC Competition Board. Marcus's project has been documented in its current state by someone from the district office who came in at 8:30 this morning. The competition board will be making a ruling this afternoon on Marcus's status in the competition and on appropriate remediation. Dana had not sat down. She was still standing near the chair where she'd put her purse. But she'd stopped performing. The careful flatness was gone. Instead, her face was doing something I had never seen it do before. Nothing. Completely nothing. Like the signal had cut out. Kathleen, she said, and her voice came out different, higher, slightly wrong. I want you to know that I have always been extremely supportive of this school. That's not really relevant to what we're discussing, Mrs. Hargrove said. Politely. Precisely. Like a woman who had been managing difficult parents for 19 years and had developed the language for it the way a surgeon develops precision with a scalpel. Dana turned to me. Rachel. Can we talk about this privately? We can, I said. But the footage doesn't go away because we talk privately. She stared at me. Her hands were at her sides. I watched her swallow. What do you want? She said. And the way she said it, the specific flatness of that question, stripped of any posturing, stripped of any of the 40 years of compressed sibling competition and petty dismissals and 3 exclamation mark texts, told me that she understood. Completely and finally, that she had walked into something she could not manage her way out of. I want Marcus to go to state, I said. She made a sound. Not a word. Something between a breath and the beginning of a laugh that immediately stopped. The project is destroyed, Rachel. I know that. You can't rebuild it in. I know the timeline, I said. Let me tell you what I need from you. I had been awake since 2 a.m. I had been thinking since 2 a.m., and what I'd been thinking was not primarily about recrimination or satisfaction. I'd been thinking about what Marcus needed. And what Marcus needed was to go to state on March 15th with a project that could compete. So I had been on the phone, starting at approximately 3:30 a.m., with everyone I could think of who might help. I need to back up and tell you something about my professional life, because it's relevant to what happened next. I've been a mechanical engineer for 11 years. I spent the first 4 of those years at that seedy firm in Westerville, a place called Kettner Precision, making $62,000 a year and learning everything I could. I left in 2018 for a position at GUN Performance Solutions, a materials and manufacturing company headquartered in Westlake, Ohio, where I spent 3 years as a structural design engineer working primarily on composite components for the automotive industry. In 2021, I moved again, this time to a position at a robotics and automation startup called Viridian Systems in Columbus, where I am currently employed as Senior Director of Product Engineering. I manage a team of 14 engineers. My salary is $147,000 a year. I have an advanced network of contacts in the engineering community in Ohio and the surrounding region that I've been building for over a decade. Dana knew I was an engineer. She knew I worked in tech-adjacent manufacturing. She did not know any of the specifics, because I had learned early in my professional life that sharing specifics with Dana meant them being used as measuring instruments for her children, for her husband's income, for whatever competition was currently running. So I kept it professional and vague whenever it came up, which it rarely did. What this means is that when I picked up my phone at 3:30 a.m. on March 13th, I had options. I called 3 people. First, I called Dr. Yusuf Adeyemi, a professor of robotics engineering at Ohio State who had been a guest lecturer in my graduate program and had, over the years, become a genuine colleague and occasional friend. He answered on the 3rd ring. He had a graduate student, a second year named Priya, who had worked on first robotics-adjacent projects and who, as of that morning, had no conflicts on her schedule for the next 48 hours. Second, I called a contact at MicrotechX, a small robotics components supplier in Gahanna that I had a professional relationship with through Viridian. I explained the situation. The owner, a man named Frank Caldwell, who I had been working with for 4 years, said, "Tell me what parts list you need." Third, I called Greg, who was asleep in our bedroom and who, upon being briefed, said nothing for 11 seconds and then said, "Okay. What do we need to do?" By 6:30 a.m., before Marcus came downstairs, I had a parts list. I had a commitment from Priya that she would come to our house at noon with specific tools. I had an order from MicrotechX that Frank was set to pull the moment they opened at 8 a.m. And I had Greg making coffee in the kitchen and Marcus's robot notebook on the kitchen table, open to the most recent schematic. We had 30 hours until check-in. But first, I needed to handle the other thing. The legal thing. Because a break-in is a break-in regardless of who does it or why, and I had filed a police report, and there were decision points ahead that I needed to understand before I walked into Mrs. Hargrove's classroom that morning. I called a family law and criminal defense attorney named Sandra Lim, who is a partner at a mid-sized firm in Columbus called Eckerd, Lim & Portis. I'd used Sandra for a contract dispute 2 years earlier through Viridian and trusted her precisely. I reached her at 7:58 a.m. and gave her a 4-minute summary. She said, "Okay. 2 things. First, do not discuss the break-in with your sister without documentation present. Second, the criminal exposure here is real, Ohio Statute 2911.12, burglary, depending on modification to personal property as well. You have footage. You have a police report. You have physical evidence. That's a strong position. What do I want out of this?" I asked her. "What's realistic?" "That depends on what you want," she said. "This morning, what do you want?" "I want my son to go to state." "Then focus on that today," she said. "Let me handle the rest. I want you to understand the arithmetic of what those 30 hours looked like." Marcus came home from school at 3:15 p.m. on March 13th to find his mother, a graduate student named Priya, who introduced herself as an engineer who knows some tricks, and Greg all sitting in our garage with his robot notebook and a set of new components from Microtech. The look on his face, first at the garage floor, which Greg had cleaned, the pieces of the old scrap organized carefully, and then at us, and then at Priya, is not something I am going to try to describe in a way that would do it justice. I'll just tell you that he stood in the garage doorway for exactly 11 seconds, and then he walked in and sat down at the work table and said, "Okay, where do we start?" He rebuilt it. He and Priya and Greg and I rebuilt scrap in 26 hours, with breaks for sleep and meals. The new Arduino board was compatible. The servo motors were matched. The camera module Priya brought was actually slightly better than the original, better resolution, faster processing, and Marcus spent 4 hours on the afternoon of March 14th recalibrating his sorting algorithm to work with the new hardware. By March 14th at 11 p.m., Scrap 2.0 was on the work table under a new moving blanket, a different moving blanket, blue this time, and we had changed the garage code. And I had confirmed with Mrs. Hargrove that check-in was at 8 a.m. the following morning. The competition board had ruled. Marcus would participate. His project had been formally documented in both its destroyed state and its rebuilt state, and the documentation had been submitted to the competition as evidence of the incident. The board statement said they would be taking the situation into account in their general conduct policies. Sandra Lim called me at 7:30 p.m. on March 13th to tell me that Dana had been contacted by a detective from the Columbus Division of Police and asked to come in for a voluntary interview. She had, Sandra told me, retained an attorney. Her own. Which brings me back to the school. When I showed Dana the footage in Mrs. Hargrove's classroom on the morning of March 13th, we had a conversation, the one I started to describe, and it continued past the moment where I told her I wanted Marcus to go to state. She asked again, with that stripped-down flatness, "What do you want from me?" "I want you to call my parents," I said. "Right now. From this room. And I want you to tell them what you did." The silence after that lasted long enough that I heard the morning bell ring down the hall. Mrs. Hargrove's classroom had a clock on the wall above the whiteboard, 9:41 a.m. "Rachel," Dana said. "You can do it now or they can find out another way. But they're going to find out." She picked up her phone. Her hands, I noticed, were not completely steady. She looked at the phone like she was trying to calculate whether there was a path where she didn't do this, some version of events where she could still manage the narrative. There wasn't. The footage was already at the district office. The police had her number. Sandra Lim existed. None of those things were going away. She called my mother. I'm not going to repeat exactly what was said. My mother is 71 years old and she has, despite everything, loved both of her daughters her entire life. What she said into the phone when Dana told her haltingly and only partial, and my mother had to ask her 3 times to speak clearly, was something I had never heard my mother say in exactly that way. It wasn't yelling. It was worse than yelling. It was the specific sound of someone discovering that a thing they'd believed about their family was not true, and that they'd helped build the environment in which that not true thing became possible. My mother said, "Dana, that is a child." Dana didn't answer. "That is a 9-year-old child," my mother said again. Like she needed to say it twice. Like she was processing it herself in real time. Dana hung up. She stood in Mrs. Hargrove's classroom with her phone in her hand and the footage timestamp still on the laptop screen behind me. "I'm sorry," she said. She said it to the floor, or possibly to the middle distance between us. "I know," I said. "But that's not the only thing that needs to happen here. My attorney will be in touch with yours." She looked up then. Really looked at me, not past me, not through me, but at me, the way you look at someone when you've run out of angles. She looked like she was waiting for me to say something that would make it smaller. I didn't. "The code," I said. "I need you to know that we've changed it." She nodded. "Just once." I picked up my bag. I thanked Mrs. Hargrove, who stood up and shook my hand in a way that felt like something more significant than a handshake. I walked out into the hall and out the front door of Riverside Elementary into a cold March morning, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the thin early light, and I let myself breathe. Then I called Frank Caldwell at Microtech and confirmed the parts were ready for pickup. There was work to do. Marcus went to state on March 15th. We drove to the Greater Columbus Convention Center at 6:30 a.m. He wore his green Ohio State t-shirt because it was his lucky shirt. He'd eaten 2 pieces of toast and a banana for breakfast. Scrap rode in the back seat in a padded case Greg had found at a sporting goods store, and Marcus held the case on his lap the whole drive, not because it needed steadying but because he wanted to. There were 47 student projects at the state competition, across 3 age categories. The room smelled like carpet and industrial air conditioning and the faint chemical tang of electronics. The judges went table by table with their scoring rubrics, asking questions. Marcus answered every question clearly and specifically. He knew scrap the way you only know something you built yourself, with your own hands, over exactly 183 days. He placed second in his age category. Second. Out of 19 projects. 9 years old, 30 hours of rebuilding, second place. I cried in the parking lot after, the unpretty kind of crying this time, the kind you don't bother hiding because the parking lot of the Greater Columbus Convention Center at 2:30 p.m. on a Saturday is not the place where composure is the priority. Greg just stood next to me with his hand on my back. Marcus accepted his second-place ribbon and a small trophy and then looked at me for a long moment. "Mom," he said. "You okay?" "Yeah, buddy," I said. "I'm really okay." He seemed to accept this. He looked at his trophy. Then he said, very matter-of-factly, "I'm going to win first next year." "I believe you," I said. We went to Easton Town Center afterward and Marcus had a double cheeseburger and a milkshake at Brio and Greg, and I had wine, and nobody talked about Dana for the entire rest of the day because we had silently agreed, both of us, that the entire rest of the day belonged to Marcus. In the weeks that followed, the situation with Dana moved through its channels. Sandra Lim negotiated with Dana's attorney. Dana was not charged criminally. She cooperated fully, provided a written statement to the police, and the detective determined that the evidence supported a misdemeanor charge of criminal trespass with property damage rather than felony burglary. And that charge was ultimately resolved through a diversion program that required community service and restitution. The restitution amount was calculated based on the replacement cost of the destroyed components and was paid within 60 days. My parents, my mother especially, had a very difficult several weeks. My mother called me twice. The first call was mostly silence, punctuated by her trying to explain decades of family dynamics and me telling her, gently, that she didn't need to explain anything to me, that I understood, but that things were going to be different now. The second call was her asking if Marcus could come over. He went. He brought scrap. My mother watched him demonstrate the sorting routine 3 times, and she applauded after each one, genuinely, with her hands. Dana did not come to that visit. She has not reached out directly since the classroom. Not to me. Her husband Brian called Greg once, in early April, and Greg spoke to him briefly and reported that Brian had been, in his words, pretty wrecked. Greg said he'd been decent about it. I believe that. By April, things had settled into a new kind of quiet. A different quiet than before, not the stifled quiet of pretending, but something cleaner. Marcus registered for the next year's competition cycle in May, first on the list, before the registration slots even officially opened. He has already started working on ideas in his brown composition book. He showed me one of the sketches and asked me if I thought it was realistic. Yeah, I said. I think it's realistic. He nodded and went back to drawing. For 6 months, things were genuinely okay. Nothing dramatic. No family gatherings complicated by the particular shape of what Dana had done. Marcus went to school and worked on his robotics notebook and played video games and grew almost 2 inches and lost a tooth and complained about math homework twice. Normal things. The particular texture of a normal life, which I had come to understand was not something to take lightly. Then last Monday, Sandra Lim called. "Rachel," she said. "I heard from Dana's attorney." I was at my desk at Veridian. It was 2:47 p.m. I put down my coffee. "She's filing a motion in civil court," Sandra said, claiming the restitution agreement was entered under duress. She's arguing her counsel was inadequate and that the documentation, specifically the footage, was presented in a coercive context. She wants the restitution nullified. I didn't say anything for a moment. "Rachel," Sandra said. "I have the text," I said. "The one she sent at 11:58 p.m. Now your son won't embarrass my son." She sent that a minute after she left the garage. It's timestamped. It's saved. I've never deleted it. A pause on Sandra's end. "Good," Sandra said. "That's very good. Send it to me today." I hung up the phone. I looked out the window of my office at Columbus in the afternoon. Then I opened my laptop and opened my email and attached a screenshot. I'd been waiting for something, actually. Not for this exact move, but for some version of it. Because Dana is not a person who accepts a conclusion when she believes she can appeal it, and she will appeal in whatever direction she can access, and she will do it right up until the point where there is nothing left to appeal to. So I've been keeping everything. Every text. Every email. A copy of the police report. A copy of the competition board's ruling. The directory log from MicroTechX with timestamps. Priya's written account, which she gave me voluntarily and which Sandra has already reviewed. A statement from Mrs. Hargrove, notarized, filed with Sandra's office in April. And the footage on 3 separate hard drives. So, what do you think? Did my sister go too far, or did the situation end the way it should have? Let me know in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next with the motion.